I'm going to share a method for drawing trees that you can apply to any tree type. And because trees are everywhere in nature and art, it will completely expand the possibilities for what you can draw and create. In today's video, we're going to be drawing this tree. And no, we're not going to be using any fancy custom brushes. Instead, we're going to use a default brush found within Procreate under the airbrushing section, the Humble Hard Brush. Patreon supporters in the Drawing Club tier will get access to this entire file, and you can actually turn off the tree and use it as a base to experiment with different tree types. Patreon supporters will also get access to my color palette, but you can follow along with your own colors if you like. Check it out at patreon.com/JogaPictures, and let's get into it. If you've been following me for a while, you know my art is pretty simple and I draw a lot of trees. So I'm going to jump into my gallery. Let's go back a bit. And yeah, you can already start to see some trees appearing here. This was from my 30-day challenge. Here is a kind of pixel arty Minecraft tree. Again, another one that's very geometric. I even did a tree artwork called Geometry, and I just was super proud of that pun. But yeah, I just like drawing trees, and I think they can just really have a really big presence in an artwork and almost be like a character in and of themselves. And I've always drawn trees as simple shapes, you know, spheres, cubes, and I wish I could say that this was purely stylistic, but this brings me to the first hard thing about trees, and that is that I've always felt that they are too complex with like no specific geometry. So it's not like a building where you can obviously say a building is a rectangle or a cube. So I would just abstract them down to a basic shape and call it style. And so like after years of doing this, I felt like I'd hit a plateau in my art. And I wanted to break out of being stuck drawing trees in this cartoony or abstract way. And it would also open up so many possibilities if I just had the confidence to draw any tree I wanted and not be stuck in this Minecrafty video game aesthetic. So about 2 years ago, I started taking trees a bit more seriously, and you can see my first attempt is actually here. You can see it looks a little awkward. I've been experimenting with custom brushes. You can see leaves for the first time ever. But overall, it just kind of looks awkward and yeah, amateurish. But this was just the beginning, and I was just experimenting, and as I did so, I began to hit the second hard thing about trees, which is that they're super varied, and there's just so many different types of trees, thick, thin, and all sorts of different shapes of leaves. I sometimes spent hours creating a custom brush for a specific type of tree, but it meant I could only draw that specific tree. So let me go out here. I'm going to show you some of my early experiments. Here I'm experimenting with various different types of leaves, circular ones, you know, thin, sharp ones. You know, here's a maple tree. And here's some more abstract kind of shapes that I was doing. And I was quite happy with these, but I found I was focused too much on custom brushes and trying to find one brush that would allow me to do everything, kind of like a magic brush. And when I couldn't achieve that magic brush, I found myself spending a long time focused on specific tree type brushes, which meant I could only draw those specific trees. And even though these trees look pretty good, like a few artworks later, I might end up bombing out and drawing something weird like this that just doesn't look good at all. Here's another example of me bombing out. So it showed that I didn't truly have like a holistic understanding of trees, and I was just getting lucky with some custom brushes every now and then. So at the time I was struggling with solving these two problems of complexity and variety, and going from this stuck phase to having a freer, more confident understanding of trees. Okay, so we're gonna get a little philosophical here, and I don't have B-roll for philosophy, so I'm just gonna jump up to my gallery and go to this file I have here, and it's gray. And a long time ago I learned in life that the truth is often in the grays rather than the blacks and whites. And I know this isn't a philosophy lesson, but I've always been shocked at how far this metaphor can go. So another way to apply this concept is to think about the difference between rules and guidelines. So rules are very black and white, whereas guidelines are more gray. They allow us to stretch and flex depending on the situation. And in this situation where we have an object that has no specific geometry and seemingly infinite number of variations is perfect for applying this concept. So instead of giving rules to drawing trees, I'm going to give you 4 guidelines that I apply whenever I have to draw trees. And these guidelines cover all trees. Once you understand these, you'll have the confidence to tackle any tree. And I'm going to call them concepts because, well, it sounds cooler. So let's dig in. Okay, so we're back in our work file, and I'm going to bring up the layers panel, and you can see I've got a references group here, and I'm going to use these to help explain to you these different concepts of the tree. And just so you know, we're going to be drawing this tree, a ginkgo tree, but I've included other tree types so you can see how the concepts apply across other trees. The first concept we want to get down is the trunk, and you can see this trunk here is pretty straightforward. Like tree trunks, most people get what a tree trunk is, but there is some slight nuances. So for example, with this ginkgo tree, we've got like a main thick trunk with just branches coming off the sides here. Let me create a layer above so I can kind of draw on top of it. You don't need to follow this, but I'm just doing this to illustrate. It's kind of something like that, with like that, like that, like that, like that. Right? If I look at maybe the cherry blossom instead, let me clear this layer. You can see the trunk is kind of different in this situation. So the trunk actually branches out early on. So instead of having like just a one primary trunk, it's got lots of splits. And then it just continues to split. Let's have a look at the other two tree types. This European larch has a strong central trunk with lots of smaller trunks coming off it or branches, and they're kind of more horizontal. And let's have a look at the last example, which is the common ash. And this one kind of looks like a merger of all the other types. You've got like a major trunk through here. Maybe I should make that white. You can see it. So you got a major trunk through here, and it looks like a lot of stuff coming off. Yeah, I mean, it's not rocket science, but there is some slight differences, and you need to be aware of them because that will inform the later sections or concepts. So let's clear this, and I'm going to actually draw my proper tree here. And just look at the ginkgo again, just to get an idea. Something like that. Okay, so it's kind of a central trunk with parts coming off like that. So let me hide the reference, and I'm going to go to my color wheel and palettes, and I'm going to choose the trunk color. And you can see here on this image, I've kind of got a staircase, and then there's kind of like a flat plane here, and then another staircase. So I'm going to put the tree right on that flat plane. My brush size is about 20%. And we're going to have like a main trunk coming up. And then as I get higher up in the tree, I'm going to reduce the brush size to about 10% and just let that thin out a bit. Okay, that's good enough. We don't want to go too crazy with it. Let's move on to the second concept, which is the leaf shape. Now, I've gone really in depth towards leaves because leaves are kind of like the single atom or DNA of the tree. Like the entire tree is built of these single leaves. And so once you understand the leaf shape, it's going to inform everything else that you do. So let me bring up the ginkgo tree here again. And if I zoom in here, you can see the leaf shape is kind of like this. And yeah, it's just got this rounded property. Kind of looks like a heart actually. And it's not too long or wide. It's not too thin. It's just very proportioned and even. And this is going to define like the kind of strokes that we use when we draw our tree. And it's also going to define kind of the shapes. So you can see here, these shapes are very prominent. Just looks like a pretty standard tree actually. Like if I zoom out here, you can see my strokes here. And what this really comes down to is shape language. So we want to get a lot of that shape language in our drawing. And this really matters a lot, not only for the outside silhouette or shape of the tree, but also for these internal gaps that we want to illustrate. So you can see these shapes are very circular, they're very even, they're just very, like if you thought of a stereotypical tree, this is what you would probably imagine. Let me just clear this layer. And let's look at a different example. So the cherry blossom, if I zoom in here on the cherry blossom, sorry for the low res, cherry blossoms are actually just really circular. They're just like, they're literally just a circle. And so because of that, they just look very cloud-like. You know, like if this shape language here is very bubbly. And again, it's very even, like the ginkgo tree as well. Yeah, it's a pretty safe shape and an easy one to replicate. Okay, let me clear this one. And let's bring up the next example. And this is where you'll see like the difference in shape language really taking effect. So this is the common larch. Sorry, no, this is the European larch. You can't really see the leaves really in detail, but you can see the general shape of them, and it's really long and thin. You're going to have a lot of like these kind of, they look like fingers, I guess, creepy fingers. And yeah, you can easily see the difference in shape language, right? Like now, instead of bubbles on the edges or the silhouette or the shape of the tree, you've got lots of spindly things coming off. And also the gaps. So the gaps are no longer like circular bubbles. Now you've got really thin gaps between your trees, trunk, branches and leaves. And yeah, these gaps and negative space in the tree really will come into play later on. So yeah, the shape language here is just really different, and that makes it a challenge. This is, again, apologize, it's a bit of a low res photo, but you can see the same idea. This one is more similar to the ginkgo tree. I'm pretty sure the leaves are more like a typical leaf. So maybe it would look, maybe the leaves would look like this. And when you put those all together or clump them all together, you get a lot of bubbly shape language. Not as bubbly as the cherry blossom, you'd still have a bit of pointedness, but obviously not as pointy as the previous example. Okay, let me delete that and let me turn off the reference layer. For this concept or stage in the drawing, I'm not going to draw the leaves yet. This is just so that you are aware of it, because it's going to inform the next stages. Density is the third concept, and this kind of touches on what I was talking about in terms of the negative space between the leaves, and this really comes down to thickness or thinness. So, for example, this ginkgo tree, I would say is more on the thicker end of the spectrum, whereas, for example, the European larch is showing more signs of thinness. Like, you know, you can see more gaps and more pass through. You can see more of the background coming through. And there are examples of other trees that are even more like thin or fine, and it really depends on the level of bloom in a tree. For example, this cherry blossom is pretty thick, but there are other cherry blossoms that are super thin with only a handful of blossoms on them. So yeah, just getting a sense of the thickness or thinness or the opacity or transparency of a tree, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And also the shape or the type. So what is the shape of the density? And I know that sounds weird, but let me give you an example. So for example, this cherry blossom here, the density shape is actually going up and outwards. So it would be like this. You can see there's a lot of shapes like this, right? It's like really sprouting upwards and outwards. So I would call this type a sprouting type. To give you an example of another type, our common ash is more of a bubbly type. So from afar or at a glance, these feel like bubbles here. Let me use white. And yeah, you just feel these bulges in the tree. The larch has a different shape type, and you can see it's more of like a falling down. And the ginkgo is more of a bubbly type, but it also does fall down a bit. So these individual leaves are falling down, for example, but they're forming like bubbles. So these aren't technical or scientific terms, these are just my own terms, but just try to take note of the thickness or thinness of the density, and then the shape type, whether it's bubbly, falling down, or shooting out. Now again, I haven't drawn anything for our actual tree yet. We still only have the branches drawn out, but going through leaf shape and density is really important because it will all go into our fourth concept, which is the silhouette. Okay, so let me delete that layer. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to put it underneath the trunk, and let's go to our color palette. I'm going to get the green mid color, and we're going to set the size to about 20%. Is that enough? You can see the color is really close to this grass color, so I'm going to create a layer underneath I'm going to make it maybe a bit white and just do that so we can see the tree. And then I'm just going to make it a bit transparent. Yeah, maybe 50%. And so yeah, just so we can see that a bit easier. And let's start drawing our silhouette. So just start painting some bubbles near the branches. Okay, so as I draw these bubbles here, you'll notice like natural gaps forming between the various sections, and that's good. We want that. We want some variation and gaps to form, and we want them to form in line with that concept of density that we were talking about before. So if I bring up my ginkgo tree, let me just group these together so I can hide them easily. This is kind of medium to high density. You still see a few gaps here, but not too many. Like there's not a lot. I guess if you had to put it as a ratio, maybe it'd be like 15% gap and 85% leaves or foliage. I'm inclined to leave more gaps though, because I just want to emphasize this concept. But yeah, you get the idea. And now that I've kind of got that ratio in, I want to make the brush a bit smaller, maybe come down to about 20%. And zoom in on any big bubbles. So for example, this edge here is a bit too straight, so I'm going to add in some smaller bubbles here. And then yeah, maybe over here. Just try to break it up a bit. The key is not to have too much repeating of the same shape, so anywhere that happens, just interrupt it. Now let's go even smaller still, 10%. And we're going to start seeing some of that shape language come through. And you can even break away from the main silhouette and kind of have dots like that. Imagine they're leaves that are straying far from the tree. Also, don't make it too dotty either. So don't be afraid to bring in some of your own strokes. So you can see I'm starting to mess it up a bit. Bring in a bit of your own artistic flair. It just helps it stop looking so programmatic or fake. And don't worry too much if it's not, for example, like this is a bit transparent. It's not really fully opaque. But that helps blend the artwork into your broader painting. And then we also want to go in with the eraser to cut out parts. And by now you're starting to see like the major clumps form in this foliage. So for example, I can see that like there's a big clump here. And so that's why I've started to continue this shape here. And you know, I can see a mini clump kind of here. So I'm going to continue this circular shape. So if you imagine that this is one bubble of foliage, I'm going to continue this circular shape and make this kind of gap here to suggest or emphasize that bubble. There might be more thinness here in this portion too. So I'm going to do that. And see how it's emphasizing that bubble. And so you want to look for those bubbles. Again, like there's like a large major section of foliage here and then another large one here. So this area would be thinner as well. And you'd start to see gaps in the leaves forming. And then see how that suggests. And we want to do the same thing throughout. Don't go overboard with it. But yeah, it just really adds a lot. And just identify anywhere where it looks too dense. So for example, usually at the bottom of a tree, like this area, it starts to thin out, so it shouldn't be all opaque like that. There should be some more gaps appearing. So just cut into it like that. And you'll notice like these are mini clumps here. So for example, that's a clump, that's a clump, that's a clump. Let me undo that. And I've suggested that with these 4 triangles. So it's not completely random, like there actually is logic to this, but you do need to have some randomness because, you know, nature is just so complex that it seems random. Okay, cool. We don't want to go too crazy with it. That's enough to get a feeling for the painting. We want to keep it loose, right? So I still want to feel like it's just been naturally brushed together. We don't want it to be so tight that like every single dot is defined. And we can save that for later when we want to do the tightening up of details. Let's move on to the fifth concept, form. So far, you can imagine this tree only exists in one plane. It just looks like a cutout. But naturally, we know that trees have dimensionality and form. We want to start defining that forward form of the tree. So what we're going to do is go to our layers. We're going to duplicate this silhouette layer. I'm going to put it above the branch layer. And then I'm going to create a layer on top of this and make it a clipping mask of this silhouette. And it means that whatever we paint now won't go outside of the bounds of this shape. And we're going to use this layer to start defining kind of those bulges or circles of foliage that I was talking about before. So let's go to our color palette and go to choose the dark green. And we're going to make the brush size maybe about 30%. And now what we want to do is identify those main bulges that we were talking about. So obviously this entire thing is a bulge. You know, like if you imagine, it's just like a giant drop, a teardrop shape. And within that, we've got lots of smaller drops forming that bigger shape. So let me undo that. So we're going to keep that in mind. So I'm going to start by shading this lower half. And the light source is coming from here, so keep that in mind. And you'll start to feel the bulges coming out. Like, for example, there's one here. There's a big one here. And it's just like shading a bunch of spheres that are bunched up on top of each other. And be mindful that, like, you know, up here in the top left, there should be less darkness because it's closer to the light source. And then down here, it should be much darker. Okay, now I'm going to choose the green highlight color, and I'm going to pop out these areas that are just beneath these shaded bulges. So for example, there's a bulge here. I'm going to use this to pop that out. Another one here, I'm going to use it to pop that out. And I'm going to get that mid-green and blend it into my dark. And just anywhere where you think it's too harsh, use the color picker to pick that color and then work it back in. And blend it. But you want to keep this harsh edge contrast. So for example, between this dark and the bright, to maintain or define that edge of the bulge. So see how before that was just a silhouette, and now all of a sudden we've got that shape appearing. And then grab that highlight color and get a smaller size brush, maybe 10%, and near the brightest parts of the tree, just try to draw some individual leaves in. Really pop those out. And do the same up here. And just be messy, you know, don't be afraid to let your natural hand shine a bit. And remember the ginkgo trees, like the shape of their leaves, they're kind of like hearts, right? So actually I need to work some of that in. But we're doing this sparingly, like you don't want to define too many leaves. I only do it on some of the highlight areas. And don't do too much of it. I think I'm getting too much here. Let's get some of these shadows back in. Yep. Here there's some more highlight areas. I'm going to walk more of that heart-shaped ginkgo leaf shape into there. Okay, I'm getting too deep into the details. I need to keep defining these bulges here with the highlights. And you'll notice as I get lower down in the painting, I'm trying to use less highlights. Or like instead of using the maximum highlight color, which might be this one down here, I might use the midtones actually. And you can see how that's creating that sensation of a bulge with the midtone. What you might find is if you go over the top with this and keep defining or rendering these bulges too much, your tree starts to look like a bunch of balls, and that's not good. So what you can do is to break that up, just use a smaller brush, maybe about 10%. And sometimes I just like to just maybe make that smaller, bring back some strokes into the painting, like just cut that ball up. Maybe use some hatching. And just bring some of that natural feel back into the image. Let me turn off this layer beneath it so we can see it in context a bit better, because the colors kind of look washed out. And yeah, now you can see it really pop, especially against that blue background. Though it is disappearing a bit into this grassy area, so we do have a solution for that. Still on our same layer, we're going to grab the sky color and bring that into some of our shadows. Get a pretty big brush. Don't be too heavy with this, but just define that underside ball edge, those bulges. And then use the color picker and pick the mixed color to work it back in. And yeah, it's just really adding a lot. And then also on these bulges here, you'll see a bit of atmosphere coming through the sky color. It's like light peeking through these gaps. And the leaves are a bit transparent as well sometimes, so yeah, that helps it pop a lot more. And all through this process, I want you to stay loose. Don't get too carried away. We're going to tighten up a bit later on, but the idea is you just want to get those initial layers done. So get the silhouette down, get the bulges done, get your shadows, midtones, and highlights down, bring up some of those shadows with the sky color, and just zoom out and get a feel for it in context with everything else. And at this stage, it's always better to just stay loose and keep it flowing with the rest of your painting. And yeah, the danger here is just don't get too tight. Keep it loose, keep it flowing. So those are the 5 basic concepts: the trunk, the leaf shape, the density, the silhouette, and finally the 3D form. Next, we're going to finish up the image with some small touches that are going to make your tree really pop. Now we're going to add a shadow. So I'm going to create a new layer, put it beneath your trees, and we're going to use the selection tool set to ellipse right here. Now make sure in your color palette you've selected the shadow color, and let's draw an ellipse right here, something like that, and fill it. Now it looks pretty weird right now, it doesn't really look like a proper shadow color, but we're going to adjust that using layer blend modes. So you'll see here, here's my layer, and you can see this little N here, and that N means normal. So our current blend mode is normal, but we're going to change this to overlay, and now you can kind of see what it looks like. If I reduce the opacity maybe to 65%, we're going to go for something that looks like this. But of course, this ellipse shape is too simple. We want to work it into the scene and make it look more integrated. So let's do that. So let's turn this opacity back up to 100%. And I'm going to duplicate this because I just want to preserve it. Turn off one of them, and let's just play around with this one. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the eraser to kind of adjust the shape of this shadow. And there's 2 main things that are affecting the shape of this shadow: the slope on the grass and like the texture of the grass, and then also this staircase. So I want to try to suggest that. I'm not going to be able to make it 100% perfect where everything geometrically and obeys the laws of physics, but I just want to suggest that feeling. So I'm going to use my eraser and put it to about 10%, and I'm just going to cut into the shadow like this, just to suggest grass. I might need to make it a bit thinner, maybe 4. And we want some of these gaps in the tree to show through in this shadow. So this is a fairly large structure. Maybe I'm going to put it somewhere like here. Yeah, actually it might be further over actually. And I'm trying to keep my strokes in this general direction, like diagonal, because I think it adds a more uniform look. It's kind of stylistic. And then I'm going to add a few kind of random streaks coming down like this. So adjust this ledge. I've already drawn kind of a shadow on these characters, so I can reduce that a bit. Actually, no, I'll leave it. I'll move the shadow behind the characters. I'm not going to erase that part of the circle. And then we also need to think about, you know, the overall shape. So we've got like kind of a triangular shape, and there's going to be this bulge here. So I guess here at the top, you're going to see a bit of a bulge coming through as well. And then see how there's a secondary bulge here. So maybe that might be that bulge here. And again, not scientific, not perfect, but just suggesting. And you can kind of use the same principles as when we were doing the silhouette. So you can add these little triangles to suggest bulges in the shadows as well. So be mindful of, there's actually a railing here. So if we do the light moving across the railing, it's a pretty cool look. So I'm trying to define that railing, the curve of it. Okay, I'm going to bring up the opacity. No, I'm going to turn it back to normal. That's just so I can work the positive aspects of the color. So instead of cutting in, I'm going to come out again, make it a bit smaller, and just get some of those leaf shapes into there. And you just want to slowly eliminate like that harsh edge of the oval. Okay, I'm going to create a new layer above this, and you notice this section here is a bit too dark. Actually, I'm going to grab this bluish color we've made. It's like a mix of the green from the tree and then the sky blue. Go back to our original layer, alpha lock it, and then I'm just going to work that in. No, I'm actually going to grab the original sky color. And then I'm just adding that, it's kind of like a saturation boost around where the shadow meets the edge. Okay, that's good enough for the shadow. Now I'm going to move back into the tree and just tighten all of this up. So let me go back to this layer here. And one thing that I feel is that it's getting a little washed out and blending in too much with this green background. So I'm going to boost the colors a bit. I'm going to increase the saturation. I'll reduce the brightness by 1%, and let's work in some of this blue shadow a bit neater, a bit nicer. And I'm going to use a small brush. And I'm going to bring some of this trunk color into the bushes here, the deepest parts of the bush. And you can see the way that I'm choosing where to put that darkest black is actually near these holes that I've punched through the silhouette, because they give me clues as to where the bulges are in the foliage. Don't forget to blend them back into your mid-green and also blend a bit of that blue in with it as well. And you do kind of have to rely on some happy accidents. Just, you just kind of feel your way around. You'll notice things popping out. Might work in some of these highlights back into here to just make those darks pop even more. But yeah, just be really sparing with it, because we are in the darker portion of the painting of the tree. And if you didn't notice, this is actually Tokyo. So that's Tokyo Tower in the background. There's a Lawson convenience store, because I'll be heading there soon. So I'm really excited, and I love Japan. It just brings me so much happiness. I can't make sense of it. It's a beautiful place. And there's so many scenes there that I just want to paint. Just remember, don't be too tight. Again, I keep saying this, but it really is the key, because if you get too tight, you just end up drawing a whole bunch of bubbles and it looks really funny. But if you just let things unfold, it can be really nice. Okay, and I'm just going to tighten up this tree trunk because it's a little messy. You can detail the tree trunk if you want, but for this painting at this distance and resolution, I don't think I will. Maybe I can. Okay, let me just alpha lock that a bit. We can add a bit of kind of light piercing through. I just used a random gray that was on here. And this can look really good, especially up here. Hey guys, it's me again. After finishing this artwork, I took a break and came back and looked at it, and I realized there's actually two big mistakes I'm making that I want to fix up, and hopefully we'll end up with a better result. So I'm going to group these two layers, and then I'm going to duplicate this group because I want to preserve that in case I screw up. Let's turn that off. And actually now I'm going to do is I'm going to merge this down into the clipping mask. So now we're all on one layer, and we're just treating this like a painting. So the first mistake was actually the colors are getting a bit too saturated, and I want to bring down that saturation. And reduce the brightness a bit with that as well, but reduce the saturation too. And this is a mistake I tend to make a lot with my artworks. I tend to paint things too bright, and it really emphasizes that cartoony look. And just to help that a bit, I'm going to reduce some of this blue. I think it's a bit too over the top. And I want it to be more subtle. So I don't know, I think sometimes I get a bit too heavy-handed with things. What I'm going to do is make sure this is an alpha lock so we don't destroy our nice silhouette. And yeah, I'm just going to bring back more of that green. I know I am risking it blending into the green grass below, but that's okay, we can manage it. And like, even though I'm painting over this blue, some of that blue is still showing through because of the pressure sensitivity. It's not fully opaque. These brush strokes are slightly transparent, and you're just building up that layer. Okay, those colors look a bit more subtle and neutral. So let's get into the second mistake, and the second mistake is that this is just getting way too bubbly. From the silhouette to also how I've contoured some of these bushes, I've kind of contoured or rendered things a bit too much, and I've lost kind of the essence of the painting, like that feeling of it being part of the painting. So an example of a contour being too strong is, for example, this contour here. You know, like these upper areas should be more green, less dark, I guess. And the parts of the silhouette that I'm not happy with are these parts. So for example, that's just one giant bubble, right? Like it's looking almost like my old artwork that was abstracting detail away. And I guess the other thing that feels a bit off is the tree feels a bit out of proportion. So see up here and up here, these bushes feel really too heavy, like they're way too dense for being at the top of the tree. Usually as you get higher up in the tree, things start to thin out. But because of these two factors where, you know, the silhouette is extremely round and also I've got these really deep blacks high up here, it's really creating that sense of mass. So I want to break that down a bit. And yeah, I think I'll start with the bubbly nature of some of these shadows. Let's reduce these. I don't mind the darkness down here, but yeah, just up here, it's a bit too over the top. One thing we can do is actually add a bit of sky color into some of these leaves to represent those leaves that are further in the background, give a bit of depth to this shape. Because the higher up the foliage is, the thinner it is. So we want to use this sky color to thin out that foliage. And another way I can help kind of soften a lot of this is to actually increase my brush size, and I just want to see some more natural strokes in this tree, like big strokes, you know, like and actually now I think it's time to start dealing with the silhouette. So I'm going to create a new layer on top of this, and I'm just going to redefine the silhouette. So I want to start with this big bubble here. I just want to break it, go back to 100% opacity. And I know I am destroying some of my pass through, but that's okay. I think there was a bit too much. I'm going to use a lighter blue for some of this. And see how this blue is kind of just, yeah, it's giving more dimension and more of a painterly vibe to the tree. And it feels less like a cartoony kind of cell shaded tree, if you will. I want some of that transparency between the tree and the objects behind it, almost like it wasn't painted on various layers, you know, like the paint is blending into its outline. Yeah, and I think like using clipping masks and layers and all that is really good for the beginning phases, but eventually you just need to step back and treat it like it's actually a painting. Now I'm going to merge this down into my tree layer, and actually I want to cut into some of these parts. Like I think this especially is standing out to me as being way too over the top, so I'm going to chop into it a bit. Turn off my alpha lock. Actually I have a layer beneath here as well, so I need to get rid of that. And one thing I forgot was to get more of that shape language of the ginkgo tree's leaves. So I'm just trying to work a bit of that in here. I mean, it is pretty close to the shape of the round brush, like it's like hearts everywhere, I guess. But yeah, I was getting a bit too bubbly, and there needs to be more of a leaf shape. So what's happening here is there's too much small detail here, like small bubbles. And what happens is when you do too many small bubbles, it reduces how well you can read the overall teardrop form. So I want more larger planes of shade so that form comes back into the picture. And of course that's not realistic at all, but we're not aiming for perfect realism in terms of every single detail. We're aiming for a painterly style that reads really well in terms of shape language. And shape language exists on the micro scale, which was like all these small little leaf shape things, but also on the larger or macro scale, like that overall teardrop. So we want to make sure that's coming through. Okay, I'm not going to add any more detail. I may do some off camera, but you get the general method of how I approach painting trees. Of course, if you really want to learn this in depth, you can try applying these concepts to other types of trees, which is exactly what I do in this month's bonus video on my Patreon. So instead of drawing this tree, I show you how to draw this tree. This is a cherry blossom tree, and there's one extra step I like to do to make this type of tree really pop. So check it out at patreon.com/JWorkerPictures, and I hope to see you guys there.